Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, CSI, How Forensics Solves Crimes, featuring Barbara Corey, JD. We are so grateful to have you all here, and especially I think you deserve a round of applause for coming in this weather. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eric Giordano. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, and we are sponsoring tonight's activity. We're thankful to the UW County campus for allowing us to host the event here. We're also grateful to many people who've helped put the program together. We're thankful for our tech support. Mr. Newmeyer, thank you. Also our intern who's here today, Rowan Lee, and Connie Nicolai and Zach Nicolai, who've been helping out with the ticket sales and so forth. The Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service is about educating and engaging citizens, addressing community needs, and developing future leaders. We're located here on the campus, but we are a statewide organization and happy to present these types of opportunities to you here in this area. Tonight's program will feature some question and answer, so we just want you to be aware that after our speaker we'll have opportunities for questions. I'd also like at this time to make a very special announcement. Barbara Corey, who's come all the way from Washington and really at her own expense in the sense that she's taking her time from her profession, and she has very graciously tonight informed me that she will be donating her stipend to provide a student scholarship for a student here at UW County. So we're very grateful for that. And at this time, I'd really like to present the chief organizer of this event, who really came to WIPPS and said, I think this would be a fantastic event, and without her, this event would not have happened tonight. She's put a tremendous amount of time and effort into this program. She's a wonderful community activist. So please welcome Mary Roberts, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming and braving the storm, or whatever we want to call it. As Eric said, I'm Mary Roberts, and I have the pleasure of introducing Barbara Corey, criminal lawyer, and this evening's speaker. As you know, we had another session yesterday at NTC, and we had over 100 people there. I think some people swapped it out and came last night instead of tonight because they watched the weather reports. We were really pleased with that. We had a lot of criminal justice students and police science students from NTC, paralegal students, and then just others who were interested in the topic. But because I've been working on this for a couple of months, I was curious if you want to raise your hand if there are faculty or students here from Rasmussen College. Oh, here's a couple. And how about Globe University? They were interested in coming too. Maybe the weather was inclement, but we do thank you all for coming. I have known Barbara Corey for many, many years, and I've always thought she had a unique and really fascinating career. And seriously, for about the last 10 years, I've done a lot of programming in a lot of different areas, and for about the last 10 years, I've thought about what could be the right venue to present a speaker and a topic like this. Well, it turns out to be the speakers series through the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. So it's a really nice audience to have just adults, and as I mentioned before, we had a lot of criminal justice faculty and students. It's a nice mix of ages, too. Barbara is a criminal lawyer who graduated from the University of Washington School of Law in 1981. And she has over 20 years of experience as a prosecutor, and she was the Chief Deputy Felony Division Prosecutor, and she's prosecuted numerous capital murders, serial murders, and sex crimes, including the very notorious cases Rasmussen and Yates, both of these crimes occurred in Washington State. And when you listen to her, you have to keep in mind that even though she grew up in Wisconsin, she is from Tacoma, Washington, so she's not used to snow or lakes or cadaver dogs who search the shorelines in the spring like we might see in Wisconsin, so she has a different geography. She's also taught at the FBI Academy, and several of her cases were featured on 60 Minutes and True TV, which if you don't know, it's a cable crime network. And several of her cases were also profiled in the New York Times, so if you Google her, you will see many of these articles. She was also instrumental in establishing the nation's first Special Victims Unit. And after all this experience and a high-profile career as a prosecutor, Barbara now specializes in the defense and the appeals of felonies at her private law office in Tacoma, Washington. So she has the unique experience of being both a prosecutor and now a defense attorney. And she's going to speak for an hour or thereabouts, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. And yesterday afternoon we had a lot of questions, so it's really your chance to ask any and all questions. And I should mention, even though it's disappointing not to have the good fresh coffee and the hot chocolate, we decided to cancel the reception because of the roads. But hopefully, if you need a stiff drink at home, you can have a glass of wine or a good cup of fresh coffee at home after you hear about some of these interesting cases. So let's welcome Barbara Corey with a round of applause. Barbara. Oh, you're welcome.
I'm going to start out by telling you that I drink a lot of water, and so you're just going to have to forgive me for that. It's very nice to be here in Wausau, and it's also my pleasure to tell you that I'm probably the only person here who really delights in the weather. We don't get snow where I live. Haven't had any snow for the last few years, except a little bit last year. So you may not like it, but I'm loving it. I've been an attorney for 32 years. And we're going to talk about how forensics works in some cases and the kind of the miraculous things it can do to solve difficult cases. Make no mistake, not every case is kind of ripe for the application of these forensic techniques. A lot of cases are solved through good old standard police work. For example, in an incest case where the child knows who the assailant is, you don't need to do DNA. You don't need to, have forensic entomology, insect evidence or insect work. There is a lot of forensic tools that you don't need to do in that kind of case. If you have a vehicular homicide, you don't need to do that kind of evidence because probably you have witnesses who, saw car A, run into car B, and that can be solved through traditional investigation, through total stations, through the state patrol doing its analysis. So most crimes, in fact, are solved without the use of the kinds of evidence that we're going to talk about today. But when you have a difficult crime and you need something extra to help you solve the case, then this type of evidence is the type of evidence that law enforcement uses. You've all probably watched, or most of you probably watched CSI. And when jurors come into court and we ask them to raise their hand if they've ever watched CSI, boy, you get a show of hands that's nearly unanimous. And jury duty, life, isn't like CSI. People don't come into a courtroom, stay for an hour, have 20 minutes of entertaining commercials for things that they don't need, and then see the case solved at the end of that time. Not how it works. That's entertainment. This is life, and criminal cases are life. And so we'll talk about what various types of forensic evidence exist. This is not going to be, obviously, an exhaustive list because we'd be here for months if we did that. But we're going to talk about some important and interesting techniques that have broader application. and then we'll have some opportunity for questions. Now, we're not here to, I guess, glorify any of these crimes, and we're certainly not here to entertain ourselves through the misfortune of others, but we're going to talk about how these techniques are applied to specific cases. I'm looking around and I don't see anybody who looks particularly, young in the sense of not being probably too young to hear some of this conversation, but I'm going to tell you in advance that some of it is going to border on rather graphic topics, and you need to know that in advance. And again, my purpose is not to offend you or to basically, say unpleasant things or things that are disrespectful of any of the individuals in the cases, but the content is necessary to explain to you how the evidence or the expertise was used in the case. So with that, let us begin. One of the areas that we're going to spend a little time at in the beginning is the subject of DNA testing. And DNA testing is something that's been around in the criminal sector since the 1980s. It started to be applied to criminal cases, in the mid-1980s. And we're going to talk about that, obviously. This is kind of a little overview of where we're going to go. We're going to talk about DNA and some illustrative cases and how DNA developed. The first type of DNA that was used was called RFLP. We'll talk about what that means and how that worked. The next step of DNA that was used is called PCR or STR. And then we're going to talk about a third type of DNA, which is called mitochondrial DNA. Then we're going to talk about some other forms of forensic tools that are used. A linkage assessment, luminol testing, staging, forensic entomology, forensic odontology, and also forensic botany. So let us begin. This is one of the first DNA cases that was done in the United States. And it was a case that I was lucky enough to actually be involved in. And the article in the New York Times was written in November of 1988. And it concerned a case that happened in our jurisdiction in 1977. And it was a fascinating case. An elderly woman who had severe Alzheimer's disease had come home from adult daycare. And it was a respite daycare. And her daughter and her son-in-law sent her there during the day, gave them a break, gave her, a little, stimulation with other adults who had similar needs. She came home, and as her daughter was getting her ready to go to bed that night, she noticed that her bra was on inside out, and that from the evidence in her panties, it was apparent that this woman had had sexual intercourse. And they took the lady to the hospital, and the hospital did what's called a rape kit. And in a rape kit, the hospital does a medical examination, and then they collect evidence with swabs, cotton swabs. They, collect them from the vaginal orifice and from other orifices, and then they're dried and they're put in a kit and they're given to the police. And so that was done with this lady. That went to the crime lab, and then they processed those basically to obtain whatever physical evidence they can obtain. Now, at that time, DNA evidence was not used. It wasn't processed. It just was kind of outside the realm of what law enforcement did. They used a blood typing, and they were looking for various markers, and they were looking for something to determine whether the donor was either a secretor or non-secretor, and we won't go into that. But at any rate, when they tested this particular evidence, they determined that basically 20% of the people, 1/5 of the people in the state could have been males, could have been a donor of this physical evidence in this case. So that wasn't really very good evidence. And I think we can all see that there wasn't probably much we could do with that. And so, this was a case that was very compelling and a case that really, cried out for some sort of justice. So, in addition to contacting all of the males that this lady had had contact with over the course of that day, which the police very capably did, they also obtained forensic samples from them. And of course, many of them fell in that 20%. And the 20% is kind of a global 20%, but more than 20% of these men, fell into that 20%. You can figure out how that works. And all of the men cooperated except one. And the one that didn't cooperate was the Red Cross van bus driver. And he just didn't want anything to do with anybody. So the police got a search warrant to take his blood and saliva, and they did. And the results on him weren't either weren't out of that 20% either. And so our elected prosecutor at that time decided that this was a case worth spending money on. And so we contacted a lab in California, excuse me, Ed Blake's lab. And it was very expensive at that time, and he was eager to do it, although, frankly, it hadn't been done before in a criminal case. And so he did the testing and determined that it was, in fact, Mr. Haynes. That was the fellow's name. And we had great numbers on it. They do, using something called the product rule, they determine what the odds are, basically, that he was the donor. And so we had great numbers, and we filed on him, charged him. And in Washington, we don't have grand juries or anything. Basically, if a prosecutor considers that he or she has enough evidence, you write up a charge and kind of throw it before the judge, and the judge has to either issue a summons or a bench warrant. So the prosecutor is the gatekeeper of who gets charged. Mr. Haynes was charged. Then we had to have a hearing to determine whether the evidence would come in. And so we had to call experts from the scientific community to persuade the court that the evidence was reliable. And of course, Mr. Blake testified. He had something of a financial interest in it because he developed the test and was benefiting financially from it. We called Linus Pauling, whom some of you undoubtedly have heard about, famous scientist, winner of the Nobel Prize. He was persuasive to the court. And we had a number of other eminent scientists who testified as well. And the trial court in Peirce County found that, DNA, in fact, did meet the standard for scientific evidence to be admitted at trial, admitted the evidence. And after a lot of testimony, hearings, and hoopla, Mr. Haynes was convicted. So it was, an interesting case. It's kind of a summary of what we talked about. It was one of the first DNA cases in the country. The test that was used for the DNA was this test called RFLP, Restriction Fragment Length Polymorphism. And really what you need to know about that, and I'm not going to talk about any of them in great detail, is that it measures, DNA is, I know you've all seen it, it's like the double helix band, and it cuts the double helix at known points on the band, and then it basically reads the DNA at that point and at other known points, and then it basically looks for the genetic markers and compares the known sample, the reference sample, the blood or the saliva that was taken from Mr. Haynes with whatever was in the evidence that was taken from the victim. And so it basically uses probes to decide whether or not they're the same. It uses a gel in this electrophoresis process to do. It takes a while, and it is cumbersome to do. Let me go back on that. And when we were doing it, one of the experts said, well, we can demonstrate this to the jury by taking some Jell-O, and putting beads in it and showing them how these will be the beads from the reference cell, and this will be the beads from the victim, and we'll move it around a little, and then they'll all kind of settle out. And I'm a girl from Wisconsin. I went to River Falls, and then I went on and did graduate school and law school, and I also went to a lot of church suppers when I was growing up in church youth groups, and I ate a lot of Jell-O salads. And I thought, boy, if you show a jury Jell-O on a tray and you make them think that this is science, they're going to think, ain't no way we should convict somebody of rape after looking at lime Jell-O with beads in it. So we didn't do that. It wasn't going to work. So they made a presentation that was actually, very science-based, not Jell-O-based. And the jury appreciated it, and they understood it, and it worked really well. So RFLP was the test maybe for 6 or 8 years, and then the tests evolved into something called, we'll get to the next slide. Well, that test evolved into AMFPI, which was a little faster than RFLP, but it's still the same kind of test, and that's still used rarely, but not much. The main next test was PCR, and we'll talk about that in a minute. PCR was starting to be used about the time that this case came along, and this case is State versus guy Matthew Rasmussen. And Mr. Rasmussen has nothing to do with Rasmussen College and is not, I believe, the founder of your school. And I mean that in humor, in jest for sure. But anyway, this case involved the abduction of little Cindy Allinger here, who was 9 on the 4th of July when she disappeared in Peirce County. And she was gone for several weeks before she was found. And she disappeared wearing that little flowered dress that she had on. And nobody knew where she went or what had happened to her. And there was an intense search for this cute little girl. When she was found, a couple weeks later, she was found under a pile of carpet in a kind of a brushy, swampy area. Cindy had been, well, the cause of death was she'd been suffocated. Her panties had been stuffed down her throat. Her jaw was broken. She'd been raped, and cigarettes had been put out on her legs. She had obvious, burn marks consistent with cigarettes all over her legs. And of course, no one knew who did it. And so after substantial investigation, it was determined that this fine-looking man, guy Matthew Rasmussen, on the left, was the perpetrator. And the evidence that convicted Mr. Rasmussen was on this shirt, and I'm just going to walk over here. Don't mean to block your view. This was the shirt that he was wearing at the time that this offense was committed. And as you can see, this is a very busy tie-dyed shirt. And the arrow points down to a portion of the tie-dye where there turned out to be a little spot of blood. And I mean, it is a very, very, very tiny spot of blood. And what's interesting is, 1, that it was found, and 2, that it was actually tested. There was a lot of controversy about whether or not that would be tested. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. And in fact, the state crime lab in Washington refused to test it. And they refused to test it because they said that, well, if it is a spot of blood, it's a spot of blood from where Mr. Rasmussen, and you can see what a clean and hygienic guy he is, would have fallen off when he shaved himself, right? Right. Wrong. So anyway, the detectives really wanted it tested. We really wanted it tested. And so, largely the detectives, but we were there with them, had meetings with the crime lab saying, you got to do it, you got to do it. And they would say, no, we have too much other work to do. So again, the elected prosecutor said, well, go spend some more public money. So we sent it off to Ed Blake in California, And lo and behold, that little tiny spot of blood was Cynthia Allinger's blood. And so there was no way that Mr. Rasmussen, who claimed to have been at a rock festival over the 4th of July weekend, and in fact who had people who said he was there, but it was like a 3-day rock festival, would have had contact with Cindy Allinger. But he'd gone back and forth. I mean, clearly he had. And the DNA numbers were great. And this PCR technique was great. And Mr. Rasmussen was convicted of aggravated first-degree murder for the death of Cindy Allinger. Now, there were other types of forensic evidence used in that case, but the DNA really kind of sealed the deal. But we used in that case something called forensic entomology, which we're going to talk about a little later. That's basically bug evidence. And bug evidence is used in forensic entomology to determine the time of death, or to help determine the time of death. And bug evidence basically uses the succession of insects to determine how long a body has been down. And the phrase, and it's true, it's catchy and maybe a little off-putting, but is, when the meat hits the sod, bugs are the first to find it. And so, when a body is dropped outside, maggots are going to find it first. And as they go through their life cycles, it's kind of, over a known period of time, depending on, environmental variables and other things, one can determine how long it's been down. And that can help factor in the time of death. So that was used with Cindy to help determine how long she'd been there, along with other factors. Forensic botany was involved. There were plants and vegetation on her body that was inconsistent with the locale where she was found. And that was useful to law enforcement because it indicated that Cindy hadn't been killed at the dump site. And so that was very effective evidence to them in trying to determine where the location of death was. Whoops, going the wrong way. And they also did use canine search dogs. As Mrs. Roberts said, we don't use canine search dogs on, icy lakes or things like that where we live because we don't have icy lakes. We don't really have a lot of lakes. We have the Puget Sound and we have some rushing rivers, but we use them as cadaver dogs in the right locations, and we use them as drug dogs and that kind of thing, explosive dogs, for finding explosives. Washington has legalized marijuana, so we have a lot of unemployed drug dogs right now, if you're looking for one. But in terms of canine search dogs, Cindy was under a lot of wet carpet, and we'll get to that. And so the canine dogs at first didn't respond to her scent because, one, they were wet, and the scent has to develop, it has to rise, and scent tends to rise as things decompose, and when something is covering up the scent, the dog can't get it. So we had DNA, and we also had a lot of other forensic tools that were used in addition to good old police work, good old standard police work. We also had, and this is amusing, I think, and maybe a little shocking, we also had a psychic in the case. And we didn't call the psychic, police didn't call the psychic, but a woman named Shirley Quattlebaum called the police. And she said, Cynthia Allinger's body is in this field. And, when you're looking for a child, or I suppose, any homicide victim, you take what you have. And so the detective went to this field, and Cindy's body was in fact where Shirley Quattlebaum said it would be. This was an enormous surprise, of course, and so the detective got on his phone and he gave the code for officer down. And the result was that every police officer in the entire county responded to this field and just trampled the scene. And it was amazing. I mean, nobody expected this psychic to, one, to call, and two, to be right. But in fact, she was right. And of course, we thought, well, Shirley must surely have been involved in this, but she wasn't. She either heard something in her psychic way, or she just got lucky. But in fact, Cindy was found as a result of that tip. So all kinds of things can happen in this world. The DNA that was used in that case was PCR, and PCR isn't so much a way of testing, although it results in testing. It's a way of taking a very small piece of DNA and then essentially photocopying it. And PCR was, the concept of it was developed by another Nobel Prize winner, a guy named Kary Mullis. That's K-A-R-Y, Mullis, M-U-L-L-I-S, was a professor at Stanford. And Kary Mullis was driving from Stanford up to his cabin at Big Bear in the mountains in northwestern California, and he dropped some acid for the drive. And as he was driving, he was ruminating on the subject of DNA. And the idea of PCR, started formulating in his mind. And he just started fixating on it, and it just stuck with him. And he wasn't, when his trip had ended, it still stayed in his mind. And so he continued to pursue that intellectually, and the whole concept of how you could take a small piece of DNA and then amplify it or photocopy it was something that he worked into a usable scientific concept. So you can actually take just an extraordinarily small amount of DNA and literally, photocopy it into billions and billions of strands. And you can do this very quickly, and then that can be tested also in a relatively quick manner. And so it revolutionized the way that DNA testing could be done. As a result of that, and the fact that it could look at a very discrete number of points or markers on a strand of DNA, made it a lot faster to use and made DNA testing, PCR testing, something that could be done in many, many more cases. And so it was, in fact, used. PCR DNA is still with us, and it's now generally known as STRs, which is the standard tandem repeat term. That's a form of PCR testing, and it's still with us today, and it's very, very commonly used. I'm not going to go through these slides line by line. This is being filmed by a local network, and I know it's going to be run. And I think probably copies of the outline then will be available on the air. What I want to talk about is CODIS. And CODIS is if you don't know what it is an interesting and highly useful program. CODIS was established by the FBI some years ago. And you may know that sort of in the olden days, and this may still go on, when people get convicted of crimes, they give their fingerprints. They're required to be fingerprinted. And those fingerprints go to law enforcement, and they're put in a fingerprint bank. And then police departments can, compare if somebody commits a burglary and there are fingerprints left. They can compare those with fingerprints in the system, and see if it's Joe Smith is at it again. So fingerprints are useful. CODIS is like a fingerprint bank, except it's a national bank, and it has DNA samples in it. And basically, every state, and it's voluntary, but I think every state, to the best of my knowledge, is participating in it at this point, sends in DNA for all individuals who are convicted of felonies. So when you're convicted of a felony and DNA testing is ordered when you go into either the jail system, if it is a felony that doesn't require prison time, or if you go to prison, you're given a couple of large Q-tips and you're watched while you do this. Basically, you're swabbed, or you swab the inside of your mouth a couple of times, and then the swabs are sealed up, and sent off to be dried. The DNA is tested, and then the profile is put into CODIS. And this is extremely important when unsolved crimes are committed, as we talked about, rape, kit, things are analyzed and they get a profile of a suspect. Law enforcement agencies can have that run through CODIS. And so cases can be solved that way. Cases can be solved that way. And this is important. Sometimes if law enforcement runs, if they're not solved that way, but cases, law enforcement runs the DNA on, for example, a rape case, and they don't, no one's in CODIS at that time, but they get a genetic profile for the suspect, they can still charge the case if it's a case for an offense that doesn't have, a lifetime statute of limitations, like a homicide case or, some type of other crime that you can charge basically forever. Say it's an assault one we have in Washington where somebody is shot and maybe loses a limb, and that has a 7-year statute of limitations. But in the course of that, in Washington, they test shell casings for DNA. And they find the shell casing, and they do a DNA test, and they get some DNA on that, and they use that as something they want to charge the case on. So they get a profile off the shell casing. They don't know whose it is. So they charge the case as State of Washington versus with the genetic profile as the number. And so you've got a case that's timely filed, that is charged, so that at some point you've got that genetic profile in the system. If somebody comes into CODIS with that genotype or that profile, they get linked together, and then you get a name of a suspect. And so then you change the charging document to State of Washington versus, this is the DNA type, AKA, Billy Jones. And so you keep cases alive, and that helps justice to be done. That's a smart way to, I think, use a forensic tool. It's in everybody's interest, for sure. It has advanced the cause of justice immeasurably, in my opinion. And it's hard to, I think, find doubters. I think one of the issues here has to do with kind of rights of privacy. If you've put your DNA into law enforcement and into CODIS and your conviction gets reversed or something, do you have a right to get your DNA back and not to have it used forever? That's an interesting issue. It's before the courts, and I guess the resolution of that is something for another day. This is a slide that illustrates what we were just talking about, how RFLP took a lot of DNA, a large size, and PCR takes just a little tiny bit, and how you could, with Carrie Mullis's process, amplify that to the amount that you wanted to do the test. Now, obviously, the slide kind of makes it out of proportion, but the button there is a button off a man's shirt cuff. So that's the size reference. And you can see how very tiny the blood sample is for PCR. It's virtually, it's less than the size of a pinhead. And then you've got a pretty big size that you need for RFLP. So in the early days when RFLP was being used, you needed a good spot of DNA. The saying was that you needed a spot about the size of a quarter if you were going to do the test. And clearly with PCR, you could have a spot that you probably couldn't even see. I'm going to talk a little bit about serial killing and want to point out that this is a book or a text that small text that the FBI put out, I think in 2005, after a conference in San Antonio, and it's available. It was a multidisciplinary conference, and it's available online through requests from anybody. I was lucky enough to speak at this, And I think it gives a lot of good information on a whole bunch of different aspects of serial killer investigations and prosecutions. It was largely coordinated by the Behavioral Analysis Unit of the FBI, and that's a unit of a lot of profilers, and they put it on, and they had people from the other units as well, but they were talking about how to integrate all of the other forensic tools that the FBI has into prosecuting serial killers. It's a useful tool. It's a very interesting document, and if this area of investigation is intriguing to you, it's definitely something that you would want to look at. So we're going to talk about the Robert Yates serial killer case. But before we get into that, I want to introduce you to one of our famous Tacoma boys. This is Ted Bundy, and he's a homegrown product, and he is truly a local boy who made bad, and met his end in Florida. But this is Robert Yates Jr., and he's a serial killer case that was prosecuted in our jurisdiction. Robert Yates, in this case, this photograph is 57 years old. Robert Yates had a long and successful career at Kaiser Aluminum in Spokane. He was retired from the military. He flew Black Hawk helicopters in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was in the reserves. He flew every weekend as part of that. He was in a family, an intact family. He had two sisters, one older and one younger. It was kind of like a Leave It to Beaver family when he was growing up. Everybody doted on him. They went to all his games. They paid for his college. His wife loved him. He had 5 kids. Everything seemed to be pretty okay on the surface. Robert Yates had a hobby, and that was that he liked to kill women. And he loved to kill women. Robert Yates killed a lot of women over time, and nobody knew who was doing it. So this bulletin board was up. There were several of these up. Help us find our killer. These are 16 women that he killed. They're not everybody that Robert Yates killed. This bulletin board was up for a really long time before Robert Yates was identified as their killer. He was convicted of 16, but he committed many, many more. We held back 3 of them just in case anything happened to his convictions on the 16. They were in one case. If Washington, every state goes up into a federal circuit, and we're in the 9th Circuit. I did this case as a prosecutor. The prosecutors call it the 9th Circus Court of Appeals, because you never really know what they're going to do. They're the most reversed of federal circuits. And so we thought, well, if something happens, we've still got these 3 other airtight cases to file against Robert. So we know about these. There are many more suspected murders that he committed. He's suspected of doing murders in Germany, where he was stationed, in Alabama, and at other posts that he served in the military. But I suspect that, we'll never know, and nobody will really ever know how many people Robert killed. This is just kind of a list just to kind of give you names and dates of when he killed people. He started in our case, in July of '75, and Patrick Oliver is the only man he killed. And he was with his girlfriend, Susan Savage, and Yates killed them at the same time. Otherwise, they were pretty much killed individually. And these were women who were working in the sex trade. I mean, they were working in prostitution, if you want to speak bluntly. And they were all, and we'll talk about some of the commonalities when we talk about the forensic tool of linkage assessment, and they were all killed one place and dumped in another place, generally in an isolated place such as the woods, except for Linda Mabin. And Robert was fond of Linda Mabin more than the others, and we know that because he buried her right outside his bedroom window. And then there was Christine Smith, who survived. And just to give you a minute about Christine Smith, Christine Smith was, like all of them, picked up by Robert Yates when they were on the street and they were looking for tricks. And Robert picked them up, and he had several vehicles. He had a Ford van, a Chevy van, a Honda Civic, and then he had a Corvette. And he committed murders in all of these cars. And he committed the murders by shooting them in a way that's called a double tap, which is like basically 2 shots and a downward in their head. And at first law enforcement thought, well, the detectives thought he must be in law enforcement because a double tap is kind of a law enforcement kind of shot. And anyway, to be perfectly candid and perhaps a little too graphic, a lot of the women were performing oral sex on him when they were shot. And Christine Smith, who survived, said that she was performing oral sex on him and he wasn't able to respond, and that's when he shot her. Christine Smith managed to get out of the car, and she was bleeding, and she not only managed to get out of the car, but she ran into a hospital. It was near a hospital, and she made her way to the emergency room. And she was just a hooker to them. And so they stitched her up and sent her on her way. And she got better, and she went on with her life. And then a couple years after that, she was in a car accident, and she went to the ER, the University of Washington Hospital, where they treated her like a human being. And they did an x-ray of her neck and her head, and they said, well, when were you shot? She said, I've never been shot. And they said, no, you've been shot. There's a bullet, a couple of bullets back in your neck, your head. She said, I've never been shot. And then she put 2 and 2 together that this event, when she thought she'd been struck, was when she'd been shot. And at that point, Christine Smith's moment of recognition and the Yates investigation started to come together. And so they came together enough so that the detectives on Yates connected with Christine, so that when Christine went into the operating room to have the bullets removed, a detective was there so that when the bullets were removed, they went to police. Now, bullets get deformed, obviously, when they go into a body, but the bullets were recovered and they went to forensics, and they were, in the condition they were in, they were examined and compared with bullets, and there was, as much similarity as in fact could be noted, was noted, and it determined that they were, not dissimilar, which is, kind of the double negative is a common way of describing things. But more importantly than that, Christine was able to give a description of Mr. Yates, a description of one of the vehicles that he had, and was able to assist and was able to be a live witness, at least to what he did to her, and that was extremely valuable evidence in solving the crime. There was a monumental amount of evidence in this case. There were 16 murders that we proved, and so in proving them, we basically decided to do them one at a time. That meant calling witnesses back because one witness a lot of the witnesses had worked on all 16. We thought it would be too chaotic or disorganized or overwhelming to a jury to have one witness testify to everything he did on 16 and then murders and then call somebody back. So we did one at a time. And we had a large trial exhibit, and we put up commonalities. It was at least as big as the PowerPoint board up here, and we listed across one top, the multiple vehicles that he'd used and which victim had been in which vehicle. We listed which test we'd used for each victim, and then how DNA from that test and whether it was the victim's DNA and the victim's name had been found in which vehicle. And all of them, there was a DNA from everybody in one of the vehicles. And it might have been on the seat, might have been on the floor, on a seat belt, on the ceiling. It might have been on something that was left behind. One of the women had a fake eyelash that had a little bit of blood on it, and that was left in the car. One of them had a sweater on that had, a fake pearl button on it, and that had a little blood on it, and that had rolled. under a seat. And so you had a case where you just had extraordinarily good evidence processing by law enforcement when they inventoried the car. And so when those items of evidence were examined, they could be tested. And they yielded, the evidence that was so important in proving the case. And it wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was other bodily fluids. There were some hair samples that were there in addition to the blood. And all of this went up on a chart. We're going to talk a little bit about some kinds of DNA. We've talked about the RFLP and the PCR, and that's nuclear DNA, and that's a combination of genes that we get from our parents, from both of them. And then there's something called mitochondrial DNA, and that passes down only through your mother, okay? And so people in your maternal line all have the same DNA. I have the DNA that my mom had. She has the DNA that her mom had. My brothers have the same mitochondrial DNA that I have. So we have the same mom. My sons have my DNA, because I'm their mom. And my oldest son just got married. He and his wife had a baby, a blessed little girl in a family of all boys. She has her mother's mitochondrial DNA. So that's how it works. I mean, it's a matrilineal DNA. And I'm telling you about that because it's a form of DNA that is used for certain types of identification. It's used, for example, when nuclear DNA is too damaged or too degraded to be tested by any of these other means. It's also used, for example, if you have a hair and it can't be tested by any other means. If you pull out a hair from your head, you know that on one end of the hair there may be a follicle, and that follicle contains nuclear DNA that you can test under PCR or RFLP, or any type of nuclear DNA test. But if you don't have a follicle on it and you just have a shaft, you can't do that. You can test it by mitochondrial DNA. That's your only source. If you have a bone that's degraded, can't get any marrow out of, you can only test that by mitochondrial DNA. So it's a specific DNA test. It's not widely available. Most state crime labs don't do it. There's a lab in Pennsylvania, Botany, B-O-D-E, that does it, and there are a few more across the country. But when you need it, you need it. These are some examples of cases where mitochondrial has proven, invaluable. On the upper left, it's not the greatest picture, but I'm sure you can tell what it is. It's the Twin Towers burning, and we all know that there were, hundreds of people killed, and because of the nature of that crime, bodies were, blown apart, and they were burned, and they were in hundreds of pieces, and they have pieces of bones and fragments and pieces of hair that can't be identified. And so, mitochondrial DNA was used when they had genetic material, from mothers or sisters and could get some mito evidence. And so that was used there. On the upper right, recovery of remains of, unknown soldiers from previous wars, been identified with mitochondrial DNA, used for that. Extremely valuable. The last picture is a history major, okay? That's the Romanoff family. Their bones were buried in they were, executed in 1908. Well, they were maybe in 18, but he was, removed from the throne in 1917 and then taken to Ekaterinburg. They were shot and then they were, dumped in the woods, and they had acid poured on them and stuff, and then they were found not that many years later, and the bones couldn't be identified, but they had some DNA from one of Alexandria's relatives, and so they used mito to identify those people. DNA, whether it's nuclear or DNA is very resilient. I mean, it's found in evidence that is centuries old, and so it's a question of degradation or what exactly you have. But mitochondrial is extremely valuable as well, and law enforcement knows it, and in the right case, it certainly is what you need to do. Now, there are some issues with another form of DNA, and this isn't a test, but this is a form of DNA that law enforcement gets, and it's called mixed samples. And you get a mixed sample, for example, in like a gang rape case where people aren't using protection. And so you get, semen from a bunch of different sources. And so when the complainant goes to a hospital and they do a rape kit, what they get is a hodgepodge of stuff, and you don't know, what the proportion is and what the percentage is. And so it goes to a crime lab, and they come back with some kind of numbers that are really hard to interpret, and it goes to a prosecutor for charging. And, you think that you know who was there, and you kind of think you know who had intercourse with this victim, but you can't really tell for sure because the numbers are so unreliable. And one of the reasons is that in the course of developing standards for DNA testing, and remember, it really hasn't been around all that long. It's been around since the early to mid-'80s. The science has been developing standards and certifications for testing of single samples. The development of the protocols and standards and certification processes for this mixed DNA stuff really hasn't been done. And so, courts it had been kind of coming in unchallenged, but in the last couple of years, there are some certification groups. One of them is called SWGDAM. It's for the Scientific Working Group on DNA Standards. Has started to address the problem of what are the generally accepted scientific protocols for doing mixed sample testing, how are you going to do it, how you can reliably, make separations of different individuals. If you can do that, how you can determine the numbers, how you can determine, product rules and say that the chances of, or the, frequency of this genotype of, John Smith, likelihood of, someone else having this DNA is 1 in, 600 billion or something. How can you do that with a mixed sample? And so courts are starting to look pretty sternly on that and dismiss cases. And it's a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue, and I think until the science kind of catches up with the issue, we're going to see less of that being admitted. It's just too hard to separate and to do the test in the kind of reliable manner that everybody in the criminal justice system, prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, think should be the basis of a conviction. One, obviously DNA is useful to do justice. It's useful to obtain convictions. It's also useful to obtain exonerations. Everybody reads in the paper, at least a couple times a week, about people who've served long periods in prison who have been exonerated as a result of DNA testing. And since statistics have been kept starting in 1989 through 2010, this is a chart of DNA exonerations. And there have been about 350 of them through that time period. A lot of people. And these were cases where there was, forensic evidence, and DNA testing wasn't done, although, during that whole time, the technology was available, but for whatever reason, people deemed the case sufficiently strong that it wasn't done, and it was done post-conviction. Does anybody know what the single most common basis for the reversal of evidentiary basis for the reversal of criminal convictions is? Anybody? Misidentification. Misidentification, eyewitness identification that fails. And this is true even when there's sort of a level of acquaintance between the witness and the person who's convicted. And, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm, familiar with the literature. And, some of the reasons are if there's a weapon, there's something that psychologists and criminologists call weapon focus, where somebody's pointing a gun at you, you tend to focus on the gun. Or the contact may be fleeting, or you just may have other concerns. You may be so frightened that you don't accurately perceive it. It may be a question of the lighting. There may be all kinds of questions, but amazingly, eyewitness misidentification is the greatest cause for the reversal of convictions. When you talk to juries, most juries place great credence in eyewitness identification because, frankly, most of us like to think when we see somebody, we can remember what we've seen. We see Mrs. Roberts and we see she has a black and white jacket, black skirt, and, has pretty brown hair, and, we think, I see her and I'd recognize her if I saw her a month from now and I had to describe her. It's probably not true. So sorry, but that's what happens, and people get convicted on that sort of thing, and it's just not right. So laws have been passed so that post-conviction people have a right to make a motion for DNA testing, and they do, and this is the result. There are something called innocence projects in many states. I don't know if there's one in Wisconsin, but I bet there is. And they do a lot of testing and post-conviction work, and this is the result. It's, exonerating people that have been wrongly convicted isn't anything that anybody should think is improper. Obviously it's something that we should all be proud of. We're a nation where we are proud of our judicial system. We're proud of honoring people's rights, and we don't want people to be wrongly convicted. Letting out the wrong person doesn't mean we don't want justice for the victim. We just have to, work a little harder and renew our efforts to find out who really did it. Doesn't mean the crime can't be solved. Just means somebody else did it. So DNA is important for convicting people and also for making sure that the right people are convicted. Linkage assessment is a relatively new and novel area of forensic science, and the experts on that at the moment are largely people from the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. The first expert was a really terrific guy, Mark Safrick, and linkage assessment basically means analyzing various crime scenes to discover commonalities. And it's not looking for what are called signature crimes, where there's like one unique fact about each crime. You can say that, Zorro did this because there's a slash of a Z on every body. It's not like that. You're looking for kind of general factors that are, general but focused enough so that you can say that the offense has enough unique or different aspects so that you can say that it was probably committed by the same individual. The same behaviors are there so that you can link the crime scenes. It helps you to determine the identity of the murderer or the criminal and to show that there is something called like a common scheme or plan, that the crimes were committed in the same general way. And it's important evidence and it's compelling evidence. Now, we use this in Yates, and I'm going to tell you some of the evidence that Mark Safrick testified to that was, I think, extremely compelling evidence to the jury. We've alluded to the fact that all of the women had that shot, the gunshot wound behind the left ear, the double tap wound. All of the heads in that case, Robert Yates didn't want to get his van too sloppy after he had shot these women. So he took those plastic bags from Walmart with the smiley face on them, and he tied them around their heads with the smiley face up. And so that's how they were found. Pretty grotesque, but that's how they were found. That was a very unique fact. All of the victims, with the exception of Patrick Oliver, who was kind of just there when Susan Savage was killed, were women, obviously. They were, should say general age group. They were all in pretty much the same general age group, in their 20s, and they were all working in the sex trade. They were all performing a sex act when they were shot, every single one of them. And after they were killed, this is troubling to think about, he kept their bodies for a while. He didn't dump them immediately. They were kept, for lack of a better phrase, so that he could recreate with them for a period of time before he dumped them. And I'm sure you know what that means, so we don't need to go into that. And he dumped them, I guess even Miss Mabin, I don't think she was killed outside his bedroom window, but he dumped them all at places, should be sites, not sides, that weren't the kill sites. So he traveled with them. The guns were the same in many of them, and so the firearms were used. There was he had a couple of different guns that he used, and he used them in multiple ones. You could tell the vans that he'd used for some. He'd used some in the Ford van, some in the Chevy gun, some in the Corvette. That's probably more detailed than we need to have. And again, there was botanical evidence that they were killed in areas away from the dump site. For example, one of the women had, beautiful flower garden vegetation on her body. She had some dahlia evidence on her. I love dahlias. And some other flowers, Sweet William and other things in her clothing. And she was dumped out in a Washington wheat field where there are no flowers. And so you could tell that she came from somewhere else. And that was important. So the linkage assessment assisted the jury in understanding how these cases were related, how they were linked together. That was important. Another area another technique is luminol, and you've probably heard of luminol if you've watched some of these snazzy CSI or crime shows. Luminol is a chemical, and it is made basically to luminesce when it is sprayed on materials that have iron in them. Blood has iron in it. I mean, everybody knows that. We take our iron pills. And so it's not absolutely determinative for the presence of blood, but it certainly indicates when blood is present. Now, what we have in this diagram is a shirt that was run through for experimental purposes by a crime lab. So on the left, 5F is a shirt that has blood on it, okay? And on this side, the upper left, it's got, obviously some blood drops, and then it's a large blood area, and then it's got some dots. It's got some blood over on the right that has been actually washed out before the shirt was marked with the fresher blood there. And then this is a footprint in blood. And so after that blood was put on the shirt was then washed several times. We all know, our moms have told us, keep your clothes clean, wash your underwear. Might be in a car accident. So anyway, this was washed about a dozen times. And then it was sprayed with luminol. And the thing about luminol is that, it will fluoresce when a substance that has iron on is found. Luminol does glow in the dark. It's very sensitive to light, and so when you spray something with luminol, you have to be in a room that is extremely well controlled for darkness. I mean, there can be no light, no cracks in the door, no windows, 100% black. So it's generally a room that's pretty much devoted to something like that. And, you know, the luminosity doesn't last all that long. So basically, when you're doing clothes and you want to mark where it is, at least when I've been there, and with a lot of detectives and the tech, and we want to document where it is, the tech puts the luminol on it, and we're all on our hands and knees with a lot of straight pins, and it starts to glow, and we just pin like the dickens to get the boundaries on it. But you can see the shoe print is still on there. You can see the big area of blood is on it, and you can see the other blood on it. You know, this is an experimental exercise to show you the power of luminol. You can use it in rooms to see whether offenses have been committed there. For example, in the Sam Shepard murder case, which I'm sure many of you know about, it's been around, you know, for decades. Did he do it or didn't he do it? The bedroom in that house was luminoled, and you know, it lit up like a Christmas tree. There was, you know, luminol drops on the ceiling and the walls, and you know, something with iron in it was splattered all over. So it's an interesting investigative technique, and it can be, it's an investigative technique, and it certainly helps law enforcement focus their investigation. In addition, investigators and really experienced, you know, detectives, and this is something that, you know, good experienced police officers can tell, as well as paid experts can tell, if crime scenes have been staged, and a lot of them are. And they're staged to divert law enforcement, to basically, you know, get them to chase after, you know, a rabbit, and to get them off the path of where the investigation needs to go. And to do that, the perpetrator will, you know, insert clues or take actions that will attempt to get the police officer to look elsewhere. And, you know, the reason for doing that is pretty obvious. And there are some things that kind of tip off experienced law enforcement officers that, you know, maybe the event is being staged. One of those things is that the suspect will give varying stories about their last contact, their last dealings with the victim. You know, I last saw her when I took her out for dinner and I dropped her off at, you know, Rosie's house. I last saw her when I took her out for dinner and she, you know, jumped out of the car at Starbucks. I was going to take her out for dinner, but she, you know, decided not to go and just called me. Things like that are really inconsistent and, you know, basically don't make any sense if you try to set up a timeline of what happened. They can, you know, move bodies, and there's a transfer of physical evidence. I'm going to explain, put it in the context of a case in a minute. They can pose the body in a way that's inconsistent with the physical evidence. And they can engage in one tip can kind of be overkill as opposed to a means of death that is what you'd call a stranger death. And just to go into the overkill, you know, crime of passion is a crime of passion, and you're angry, and you're angry at, you know, someone you love or someone you're angry with. And a crime of passion is a crime where, you know, you use more force than you need to kill somebody. You know, you stab somebody 20 times or 49 times, and you don't need to do that. You know, the person's dead after, you know, maybe 3 or 4 stabs. That might even be overkill, but you just keep doing it because you're so angry, and you just want to, it's just to get your anger out. It's overkill. And that's a sign of an intimate relationship. It's a sign of some type of bond between the perpetrator and the victim. But to go back, just to give you an example of a case that we had, it was some good Scandinavians. Carol Carlson was the mother of Daniel Carlson. Daniel was married to Lisa, and Daniel and Lisa had these gorgeous little boys. And Daniel and Lisa were going to get divorced, and the custody of these little boys was hotly contested. And Carol, the mother-in-law of Lisa and the mother of Daniel, wanted those boys for herself. She called them my babies and was determined to have them. And so Carol persuaded Daniel, and Daniel was, you know, a milk toast, and he was mama's boy, that they should kill Lisa. And so they did. And they shot Lisa in the head. And they shot Lisa in the head up here, you know, right on the kind of the back top of her head. And they shot her twice. And they shot her in their home, in Daniel and Lisa's house, in the living room. And the story was that Carol was at home and that Lisa was at home with the two kids and that Daniel was at work. And that these two little boys, who were about 3 years old, twins, came running through the woods, and it was like a heavy, thick northwest woods. And these two little boys came running through the woods saying, "Nana, Nana, help us before the bad man gets us too." Well, I've raised little kids, and I bet you have too. Little kids don't say that, and they can't run that far through woods, you know, no matter how many times they've been through grandma's house. You know, it's just, life isn't like that. And so then grandma gets on the phone, and Lisa's dead, so she's not picking up. And she leaves these messages, and she goes, "Lisa, this is Carol. The boys are down here. You better come and get them." And she leaves a couple of those. But they go over to Lisa's house, and she manipulates the answering machine, and she deletes calls. And it changes the time on the answering machine and basically makes certain other leaves mechanical clues on the answering machine. And we know that because the answering machine was sent to the FBI. I guess even though the expert said it was a really cheap answering machine, Walmart one, it took him a long time to analyze it. And he could tell when the calls were made, when the calls that we knew had been made from others had been deleted, and what was the interval of time that the deletions had run. And so we could tell when this alibi kind of thing had been being set up. At the same time, Carol called Daniel from the school where he worked and told him to come right home. And he came home, and so that he walked in the house and he found Lisa dead, and that, you know, she'd been shot, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And Lisa had clearly been posed. She was lying on the couch, and her head was on the arm of the couch, and Lisa had really long blonde hair. It was just beautiful. And he said he'd found her like that. And her hair was very, very long, as I just said. And on the back of the couch, you could see that her hair, which was full of blood, you know, it had been pulled. She'd been pulled, and so the back of the couch just had long, long streaks where her hair had been pulled. You know, just, you can imagine what that looked like. Her hair had just been pulled, and it was like, you know, streaks from a paintbrush. It had clearly been pulled along the back of the couch. So her body had been moved. It had been moved. In addition to that, there were other gunshots. She'd been shot in the back of the head. She was lying with her head on the arm of the couch. There were shots that went up across the room, up in the wall, you know, at an upward angle, inconsistent totally with the shots that Lisa had in her head. And so the expert was able to, you know, put her body, you know, we'll put a dummy of her body in the upright position and show, in fact, how she was actually shot. Kind of the ultimate demeaning aspect to it is that Lisa was lying down, and she had in her left hand, which was exposed, the controls to something called a Swedish erotica sex toy. And that had a wire to it, and then there was the actual Swedish erotica sex toy, and that was lying on the outside of her thigh. I mean, it wasn't anywhere near the intended place. And there was a porno movie that had like reached the end, so it was just on the way a DVD is, you know, over with. It's just kind of black. Whoops. And Lisa was totally covered. I mean, there was a blanket totally up to her chin. And the expert on staging said that, you know, when you cover somebody in that manner, it's somebody that you know. You know, if you kill a stranger, you don't care what they look like when you leave. I mean, it's somebody that you don't know them, you don't care. You just do whatever you want to do. You know, you kill them, you commit the robbery or whatever, and you're gone. This is somebody that the person cared about, wanted to, despite the Swedish erotica sex toy, leave them with some kind of respect or semblance of dignity. So they were covered up when they left. All of these factors caused, well, the police, the detectives who arrived, and the experts to agree that, and to testify that this was a staged homicide. And that testimony, when you had Daniel and Carol and a couple of other people testifying about, you know, their alibis, supposedly Daniel came home early to take him to the zoo and stuff like that, was really compelling evidence to the jury and weighed heavily in their minds when they convicted Daniel and Carol of killing Lisa. So it's this kind of novel evidence, but evidence that experts will testify that goes a great way to convicting people. Forensic entomology, time flies. We talked about this a little bit, but really insects do colonize in a definite life cycle. You can see it there. And depending on the environment, temperature, kind of whether the body is clothed or unclothed, you know, whether the area is brushy or, you know, kind of open to the air, whether it's sunny, whether it's cloudy, a whole bunch of factors, you know, the life cycles will be affected. And certainly, you know, it's not like looking at the clock. It's not going to take, you know, 45 minutes for the maggot eggs to turn into the first star maggots, but it's certainly reliable enough so that with other factors it can assist an expert in helping to determine the time of death. This is absolutely fascinating evidence to put on. It is reliable. Fact finders, juries, and judges love it. It's proven reliable in lots of cases. There's an expert in Indiana named Neil Haskell who's widely used, probably around this part of the country. We've used him. There's a guy in Hawaii, Madison Lee Goff, that we use a lot, who's written a fascinating book called Fly for the Prosecution. We'll get to that next, but this kind of evidence can be used, as I talked about, for determining time of death. It can be used to discover child abuse. People, unfortunately, in our part of the country, and maybe your part of the country, will use insects to abuse kids. They'll have like bees sting a certain area of their body. It can be used to discover abuse of like elderly people in hospitals. They can see insects and maggots on them to determine, you know, that they haven't been rolled over or washed or that kind of stuff. It's disgusting, but true. Police will see it at, or need to be aware of it at crime scenes. If they're dirty and they're looking at blood spatter, you know, on the walls from assaults or whatever, insects may have gone through it and affected the pattern. So it's the kind of evidence that is important. You need to be mindful because it can affect the investigations in a lot of ways. In his wonderful book, A Fly for the Prosecution, Madison Lee Goff has a pretty notorious case where a woman that he had looked at found had been dumped in a sugarcane field, and she had had vegetation on her that was not consistent with what was found in a sugarcane field, and so he could tell that her body had been moved there, and lo and behold, in fact, she'd been killed in an apartment, and it had been moved there. And so that's the kind of thing that he could tell that from the insects. And that's the kind of thing that you can tell with that. Botanists are important. You can do the vegetation thing, and I was jumping ahead in my mind. Plants are inconsistent as they were with Yates, and so that's why you get a forensic botanist. But I want to jump back on the entomologist subject for a moment, if I might. We're getting near the end. But these experts, Madison Lee Goff and Neil Haskell, have pieces of property, and they will dump or they will locate bodies of dead animals, generally pigs, and in different microclimates and at different times and in different parts of the year to study the effect of climate. And then they'll go back and they'll collect the insects to see their stages over time, basically to test or to collect the succession, to collect the insects to study the succession to determine the rates, to see how different things affect that for the calculation of the time of death. That's very, very fascinating. In addition to that, the FBI has what's called the Body Farm. It's in East Tennessee, and you've probably heard about that. And I mean, they have animals, but of even greater interest is that they have some humans there, and some people donate their bodies to that, when they die, and that might be a little unfathomable, but it certainly advances the cause of science, and these bodies are put out at the Body Farm, and they're studied in the same way, and we've all gained a lot of knowledge from that. So that's going on too, and it's of the greatest assistance. We've done the botany. I'm not going to spend more time on that. Forensic odontology is the study of bite mark evidence, and if somebody has a bite mark on them, it's possible to determine whether the bite mark was inflicted by the suspect. You look at the bite mark, you can get a dental impression of the suspect's teeth, and then you can basically have the impressions of just the surface of the teeth, the bite mark, basically made to size and put them on the bite and see if in fact there's a match. I mean, sometimes there's a beautiful match and you can make an exhibit on Mylar and flip it over and there's just no question. Sometimes it's a good way to eliminate a suspect. That is done by a dentist. There's a society of forensic odontologists. There aren't that many of them, but the evidence that they give is extremely important, and they're a fine tool. There are lots of, certainly, areas of forensics that can be applied in criminal investigations, far more than we've been able to talk about today. This isn't Rib Mountain, but it's our mountain. And at this point, I would be delighted to take any questions that you have. Anyone? I'm kind of blind. I can't really see hands, so.
Did they ever find who did the murder of Sam Shepard's wife? Sam Shepard? Did they ever find who did her murder? Of Sam Shepard's wife?
I heard your question. I'm kind of an investigative. I'm interested in the investigation. I don't really know how that case ended. So that would not be something I could answer. Maybe someone else knows.
Do people stage the opposite way? Like if it's some intimate person that kills them, like somebody close to them, do they mess up the crime scene?
Oh, yeah.
To look like, I mean,
Sure.
there are a lot of that too?
Oh, yeah, to make it look like, it was a stranger, that somebody broke into the house and it was, some kind of,
Don't take the time to like.
right, that it was a burglary and they'll ransack the house and, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
What courses did you teach at the FBI Academy, and do you still teach there?
I haven't taught there for a couple of years. I have taught, I taught the Yates case several times because there are a bunch of areas in the Yates case. And I have assisted Mark Safrick with teaching some profiling courses. He has recently retired, but I've worked with him on those. And mainly cases, I'm not a scientist, and so they've been cases that deal with behaviors in those cases and basically putting complex cases together.
I'm just wondering what brought you to switch sides, to go from being a prosecuting attorney to being on the defense side?
A desire for personal growth, I think, and a desire to basically see things from the other side. It's not a big career hop. A lot of people do it. I would say there are a lot of prosecutors who become defense attorneys.
If a victim or a victim's family wants to have something tested in a lab that's out of state, such as you mentioned Ed Blake's lab, how do you do that? I mean, because the detective would probably say, we can't pay for that, or it's too expensive, or whatever. Is that commonly done or accepted? If a family wants to pay for it, or, the victim's family?
No, they're not allowed to pay for things. They're just not, evidence isn't released to private individuals in any case, and, private individuals aren't allowed to pay for testing. Prosecutions are between the government and an individual, and it's simply not appropriate to take money from private individuals to do that. It would certainly negate any appearance of fairness, that it was a public prosecution. It would lend the appearance that the government was not acting on behalf of the state or on behalf of the community, but rather that the government was being manipulated or was being bought by whoever was paying for the test. That would not be acceptable under any circumstances.
I was wondering if you could comment on what might be the cause of crime, causes of rape and murders of women.
There are so many causes, that I don't really think that that's the kind of question that probably anybody could answer. I mean, really, there are as many causes as there are human beings. I mean, Mr. Yates, I think for example, I think he killed women because he liked to. I mean, I think he visited a lot of prostitutes, and we had testimony at trial from a lot of women in the sex trade that he had very pleasant and successful dates with. And we know that he killed women probably that he didn't have very good dates with. We know that he went out one Christmas Day when he was with the fam and his parents, and they'd opened presents and had dinner, and he left the house for an hour and a half, and he went out and he picked up a woman and he killed her, and then he went back to the family. I think that it was kind of the thrill of the kill for him. Other people clearly have mental disturbances, and they have other reasons for doing it. Everybody's different. Everybody's different. I really couldn't answer your question, I guess.
Could you say whether all these CSI shows on TV are accurate depictions of forensic science?
They're entertainment. I mean, they're entertainment. They're not there for, for educational instruction, but they're entertainment. Sure, there's a kernel of truth in them, but their life is not so dramatic, is it? I mean, they're talking about kind of general scientific concepts, but they're not certainly hard truths.
Of all your different ways of collecting DNA, what is the time frame of getting DNA back? Do you know?
Kind of depends on where you're practicing and what your lab protocols are and that sort of thing. It depends largely on jurisdictions. I mean, some jurisdictions have in their county crime lab do DNA, so you can send it downstairs and it comes back right away. I mean, in a couple of days. Some jurisdictions have like a state lab and it goes off and you don't get it back for a matter of weeks. Some jurisdictions have a state lab and they'll prioritize your case, and if you call, you can kind of sweet talk them into getting it done in 2 days. So I guess the answer is it's highly variable from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and there is really no definite answer. Washington had one DNA lab for several years, then they went to 2, then they went to 3, and then King County and Seattle and Peirce County, or neighboring counties, just didn't think that was sufficient. So we have our own DNA labs, and it gets done a whole lot faster. And then if there's a test or something that we want done that they don't do, we pay the money and send it out. But
for young people that are interested in criminal justice, what steps do you suggest to go about doing that?
What aspect of criminal justice?
Like the FBI behavioral analysis.
Well, I think you need to, you should talk to them, but they are interested in people with a psychology majors, people interested, in some type of, also a legal component, criminal justice kind of understanding. Mark Safrick, who is, a good friend of mine, had a very successful career, and it actually started as an FBI agent, and he was first posted on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and then he got into the behavioral analysis unit and started working as a profiler, and then was in the BAU and kind of worked there. When he was in there, took the training and worked his way there.
With DNA testing that's being done sometimes for experimental purposes or for study in universities, and sometimes actually kits that are sent out and people submit their DNA to be looked at and genetics. Do you think there will be a time in the future where there will be a coming together of all of those to try to use it for solving crimes?
You mean people will be able to get kits to solve crimes, or? And I don't mean to be dense, but apparently I am.
If people are submitting their specimens for genealogy or for experiments that are being done at universities and whatever, do you think there will be a time that there will be an access point that material can be given forth for solving crimes?
I guess that's a civil rights question and a privacy question that courts and society are going to have to resolve. There's a lot of information in DNA, that isn't in fingerprints. I mean, fingerprint evidence, well, it certainly is not without its issues, but that is limited. I mean, you can count the ridges and the other, identifying characteristics of a fingerprint. They can't tell you, if you have some genetic diseases. They can't tell you, the load of information that you can tell in your DNA. And I think that there is so much information in DNA that people need to be, I think, protective of it. I'm not so sure, and I haven't committed any crimes, I can tell you. I'm not so sure that I want my DNA floating around. I just don't. And I think that, I think it's like the ultimate disclosure of everything about you in terms of your physical makeup and your medical issues and any genetic variables that might be unique to you or special to your family. And I don't know if I want that out there available to everybody in the universe who might have access to a DNA bank. Other people may feel differently. I guess that's my feeling at the moment, and I think I think it's a debate that we as a society need to start engaging in, and I know that that's a big concern in the courts, and I expect in the legislatures, I know people are really concerned, as I said, about what do you do with people in CODIS whose convictions are overturned. I mean, do you take their DNA sample out of the system because they haven't been convicted, and that's what it's supposed to be? Because there's a lot of information there. I mean, there just is. And, you know, at some point, it really implicates a privacy right. So, yes?
That CODIS, is that something that you have to go at on the innocence projects or something like that? Or does it just come up and then they exonerate them like that? I mean, do they have to be going after an appeal or to get it taken off?
Oh, CODIS is, okay.
Do you know what I'm saying? Okay, it comes out that they didn't do it.
Okay. Yeah, that's unrelated to CODIS, okay?
Oh,
CODIS is like a fingerprint bank.
Okay.
Okay, except that it's a DNA bank, okay?
All
and
right.
that's like a data bank that the FBI keeps that law enforcement puts information into, okay? And then the post-conviction, so we'll leave that over here, okay? And then after you're convicted, if you want to do a post-conviction DNA test, then a defendant has to basically petition the court for permission to do one. And then the defendant doesn't have the evidence. Obviously, the state has the evidence. And so the court has to grant a petition, and then the evidence has to be released from the custody of the state. It has to be transferred to a lab that'll do it. Generally, the court will order a state crime lab to do it. So basically, the state crime lab does the test. The evidence stays in the custody of the state, and then they do the test and report the results. So that happens there, and CODIS is over here. And if the person is exonerated at this point, you know, the profile, the conviction information stays in CODIS, okay? So they're unrelated. But the person, you know, their conviction is exonerated, and after years spent in prison, they get to go home.
But they have to be actively going after the exoneration.
Right. They don't, you're not.
Like they're going to find the evidence and say, oh, we were wrong, you get to go home?
Right. You have to make a petition. I mean, the evidence is in there.
Okay.
It just hasn't been tested. And there are lots of reasons that evidence doesn't get tested. You know, the state may feel that they just don't need to test the evidence. And they've got a strong case. They feel like they've got eyewitness evidence that's reliable. They may feel that it's a strong case for other reasons, and they just don't need it, and then they're not going to bother. And so it just sits there untested. And then somebody decides to test it later. And that's a legitimate decision that prosecutors make. And pre-trial, defense doesn't really have the ability to, defense doesn't have the ability to get the state crime lab to do tests. And so if they want to test, they basically have to get other money at another lab to do the test. Looks like Mrs. Roberts is here.
We do need to wrap it up. Thank you again for coming, and I think it was a really nice opportunity for all these criminal justice, police science students, and also for adults. And let's give Barbara Corey a round of applause.
Thank you.